Slide up there somewhere, I think. Andy's making his way back there, doing double duty today. We are in 2 Samuel. Whoops.
Too fast.
Andy, you're really on the spot. That's exactly what I want to do. In just a second, though, you crushed it. I told Andy I was going to go out of order on my slides. I messed my slides up last night, and so he's messed up ahead of me. We're in 2 Samuel chapter 9 this morning. And for me, this is one of the great hidden gems of the entire Bible. It's only 13 verses long, so we're going to read the whole thing this morning. But the story that unfolds in such a short amount of space in my life has taken on maybe an outsized role relative to the amount of time that's spent on it in the Bible. But I find it to be such a rich story and a little known story for a lot of folks, whether you've been in church for a couple of weeks or been in church your whole life. Not a lot of folks know this story. It's buried in the middle of a long narrative about David's life. And so it's easy to skip over it and kind of move on because there's some goofy names involved in it, and some of it's easy to understand without any additional background, and some of it with just a little bit of background takes on, I think, a whole new life. So by way of background, 2 Samuel 9 is 2 chapters after 2 Samuel 7. And if you remember last week, 2 Samuel 7 is, the way I talk about that chapter is that it's like driving between Topeka, Kansas and Manhattan, Kansas. A lot of people think of Kansas as just woefully flat, and western Kansas is disgustingly flat. But eastern Kansas actually has a lot of, northeastern Kansas actually has a lot of terrain to it. And Highway 70 that goes between Topeka and Manhattan, Kansas, Mark and I lived in Manhattan, Kansas for a couple years. At a certain point on the interstate there is a rise, there's a hill, and it's as though you're coming into western Kansas. And the flatness of it, when you get to the top of the hill, you can look out the windshield and see basically the end of the earth. I would say Colorado, but I think you can see past Colorado even. And what's interesting is that at the same time that you're looking out the windshield of your car, seeing into the abyss of western Kansas, you can also look into your rearview mirror and see all of eastern Kansas, like almost to the Mississippi River is what it feels like. And so it's this interesting moment. It just takes place, it's very quick because you're going 75 miles an hour on the highway, happens very quickly, but at this certain moment, you can see everything that lies ahead and everything that came behind. That's what 2 Samuel 7 is for me in a lot of ways. It gathers up everything that God had done before that moment. And all of the promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the promise in the Exodus, the promise to Joshua, the promise to the judges, the promise to David. It gathers up everything that happens in Scripture before that moment. But it also helps you look forward to the ends of the earth as an eternal kingdom is established. And so it's this interesting moment in 2 Samuel 7 with this covenant that God offers David, this eternal covenant that God offers. So all that is only 2 chapters before. 2 Samuel 8 is a chapter that I typically skip. I don't read it. And I got to tell you, this morning I was rereading and kind of curious because it's been a minute since I read chapter 8. And I noticed something that I've never noticed before as a step between what happens in chapter 7 and the beauty of chapter 9. So, Andy, you've got the map. You're already on it. So we're going to skip ahead. We'll come back to all that. So this is our map of Israel, right? You've got your Sea of Galilee here, the Jordan River, and the Dead Sea of the Mediterranean Sea. Here's Jerusalem. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So what happens in chapter 8 is that David defeats the Amalekites over there on the west. David defeats the Moabites over here on the east. David defeats the Edomites and the Amalekites. And then he defeats for God. Zohab, it's a name. Zoba, switched it. He defeats Zoba up here. Do you notice anything about what David has conquered, the victories that God has given David? Everything around him. In the wake of the covenant, in the immediate aftermath of the covenant, the victories that God has delivered David are complete. They completely encircle Israel. God has delivered not just Israel, but the territory around Israel to David. It's just an interesting, hey, I promised you that that your descendants would inherit an eternal kingdom. And oh, by the way, I just happened to deliver you north, south, east, and west. I love that. I love that because I love maps, which you know. But I also love that because it's an immediate response from God. It's an immediate sign from God that says, I'm not screwing around with this. I'm not playing around here. I'm going to do what I said I was going to do. And here's the evidence. So imagine then what David must be thinking. Andy, we can go back to the first verse. Imagine then what David must be thinking at this moment in his life. He's received this outrageous covenant from God. He responds in the second half of chapter 7, this beautiful prayer. Who am I? Who am I that I would deserve this? And then God delivers him the compass. North, south, east, and west. In those moments in our lives when we have been incredibly blessed, in those moments in our lives when we become aware, right? Too often, I think, at least for myself, I'm not always aware of all that God is doing for me. But there are these moments of clarity, you may be familiar with them, when suddenly I become aware, holy Toledo, how much has God done for me? I think that's this moment for David. After chapter 7, after chapter 8, I think present on David's mind is this awareness of just how much God has done for David. So what we're going to read in chapter 9 is David's response. And I want to read this entire chapter. I want you to read this entire chapter through the lens of what does it mean for me to be aware of what God has done for me and to reflect that in the way that I engage the world around me. The world around you may be your family, it may be your neighborhood, it may be your colleagues, your co-workers, your extended family, your friend network, your community, whatever. Hey, you fill in the blanks on that one. But that's the lens through which I want to read chapter 9. So, it's time to get started with one of my favorite chapters of the entire Bible. David asked, is there still anyone left in the house of Saul to whom I may show kindness for Jonathan's sake? Starts with a question that's so crucial. And it starts with a question that, for me, it does two things. It circles back to the covenant that God made, or that David made with Jonathan. You may remember a few weeks ago, David and Jonathan's relationship was special and unique. Their bond together, they were bound together by God, and that bond was powerful. And the commitment that they made to each other was to care for each other's families, no matter what happened. And so, at the beginning of chapter 9, it feels as though we're hearkening back to that covenant. But don't let it obscure the fact that this is taking place in the immediate wake of God's covenant with David and God's deliverance of the compass to David. Both of those things are happening simultaneously. A lot of times when we read this chapter, we think, oh, this is just about David fulfilling the covenant he made with Jonathan. And it is that in part. But it is not only that. It is not only about David fulfilling his covenant with Jonathan. I think it's about David's response to what God has given him. So that's the question that kicks us off. Is looking for anyone left. If you remember, Saul and Jonathan are both dead. And we'll talk more about this in a minute, but typically the family of a disgraced king doesn't fare too well post-disgrace. Verse 2. Now there was a servant in the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and he was summoned to David. You scroll forward to verse 2. Who was summoned to David. And the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" And he said, "At your service." And the king said, "Is there anyone remaining in the house of Saul to whom I may show the kindness of God?" And now we're starting to fill in some of the blanks. So Ziba, keep in mind, by the way, Ziba is one of them. Ziba's name is great. I don't know if any of your wives are pregnant, but we're going to run into some great names. If you're looking for some, it means post or statue. So very inspirational name in Ziba. Ziba is one of them. He doesn't really belong in David's court because he's one of the house of Saul. If you remember from 1 Samuel, Saul and David, their houses don't get along. There's lots of animosity there, lots of enmity there. And yet, for some reason, somehow Ziba is serving in David's court. That's going to be important, so keep that in mind. David calls out to his servant, "Hey, do you know of anybody that's left in the house of Jonathan?" Jonathan and David were close. David knows Jonathan's family. But there's been so much turmoil over the last couple of years that people have lost track and scattered. And so David calls in somebody who used to serve in Saul's court and says, "Hey, who do you know? Is there anyone out there that I can show not just kindness, but it says the kindness of God?" And this word, we've already run across this word multiple times in this study. This word hesed, you can pronounce that any one of like 78 different ways. This word hesed is incredibly important, not just in the story of David, not just in 1st and 2nd Samuel, but in the entire narrative of Scripture. This word hesed is really important. It communicates the loving kindness of God, the covenant loyalty, the covenant faithfulness of God. This is the word that's used to describe the gift of grace in the Old Testament. This is kind of how I think about it. Grace dominates the New Testament. Hesed, similarly, dominates the Old Testament. We often think that grace shows up on the scene when Jesus comes, which is not true. Hesed has been there all along. God's gift of loving kindness has been there all along. And here we have David, who is asking the question, to whom can I show grace for the sake of Jonathan? To whom can I show the kindness of God, the covenant loyalty of God? And you can hear the wheels, I think I can hear the wheels of David's mind turning. I have been given so much. Who can I give the same thing to in my life? And his mind goes directly to this brother of his, Jonathan, who's passed, but who may still have family hanging around there somewhere. So, let's see. Ziba said to the king, "There remains a son of Jonathan. He's crippled in his feet." And the king said to him, "Where is he?" And Ziba said to the king, "He's in the house of Machir, son of Ammiel, at Lodabar." Oh, this is good. Go ahead and go on to that next slide. There we go. So here's what we know. Again, names, pregnant women, names, Machir, Ammiel, Lodabar, Ziba. So Ziba says, you know what, there is somebody who's left. But what do we know about him? We know that he is the disgraced grandson of a dead king. We know that he is physically crippled in the language of Scripture, which is intended to the people who originally heard this. This is intended to communicate God's condemnation and judgment. Clearly, this is not how we think about physical infirmity now. In this culture, when you hear that somebody is crippled in his feet, we are intended to hear consequence of sin. So this is the disgraced, shamed, and lost son of Jonathan, lost son of Saul. He lives in Lodabar. Do you know where Lodabar is? Neither really do we. But we do know where Jerusalem is. This is Jerusalem. There we go. So, all of this, there we are. I mean, you took away the surprise of it, but Lodabar, you took it back. Go ahead and put it up there. Lodabar, this is our best guess about the location of Lodabar. Notice this is on the other side of the Jordan. When we think about Israel, we're thinking about what happens on the west side of the Jordan River. There is some Israelite territory on the west side of the Jordan River. But think of it this way. Can you get any further away from David and still be in Israel? Not really. I mean, you theoretically could. We got Damascus up here somewhere. That's not in Israel, though. This is about it's as far in the opposite corner of Israel as you really could get in a backwoods, no-name town. Now, if we were in Texas, I would talk about Oklahoma. And I would talk about Oklahoma being a place that nobody goes and nobody wants to go. I love you, Bob. I'm not casting aspersions here. In Georgia, I've not yet figured out, and I would often talk about Fred, Texas, too. Fred is a small town that nobody really knows where it is, and very few people have heard of it. That's Lodabar. I don't know what that would be in Georgia yet. Are we talking about Alabama that way? I don't know. I went to the Conasauga Snorkel Hole this past week with my family. It's on the Georgia-Tennessee border. You heard me right, the Conasauga Snorkel Hole. I think that's Lodabar. It took about 45 minutes on a dirt road to get there, and as my wife's family is fond of saying, we were out alone. And that's Lodabar. That's where Lodabar is. That's where Ziba is, or that's where this disgraced, crippled, lost son of Saul and Jonathan lives. He lives nowhere, as far away from the Israelite king, as far away from David as he could possibly get. That's who we're talking about. I think that context is really important for us as we understand what David is about to do. We need to understand that this man that Ziba's talking about, we don't know his name yet, but this man that Ziba's talking about is nobody. He has no identity. He has no home. He has no family. And he is lost. That's who we're talking about. Please don't lose sight of it. All right. What verse are we in? Let's go to the next. There we are. Verse 5. Then King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir, son of Ammiel, at Lodabar, Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and did obeisance. And David said, Mephibosheth. And he answered, I am your servant, Mephibosheth. Who's got some grandbabies on the way? Anybody want to name your grandbaby one who scatters shame? It's up for grabs. Hasn't been used in an awful long time. Mephibosheth is a great name. And that's the son of Jonathan, grandson of Saul, that we're talking about. David sends to Lodabar, sends Ziba or somebody up there to bring Mephibosheth home. Well, not home, but to Jerusalem. Now, what do you think Mephibosheth is thinking in this moment? That's exactly right. What does the new king do to any possible threats to his throne? Eliminate him. I think that means death. Exactly right. That's what the new king always does. Whether you're talking about the king of Israel or the king of England, the new king always kills the old king's heirs to make sure that the new king's sons would stay on the throne. So Mephibosheth, when he is found in Lodabar and makes that long journey from Lodabar to Jerusalem, this new shiny capital, that whole trip, don't you think he's thinking, well, I guess it's over. I guess this is how it ends. He shows up, and David calls him out by name. Mephibosheth says, I'm here, and he bows down. Now, listen to David's response. You know what Mephibosheth expects, but listen to the distance between expectation and reality. This is verse 7. David said to him, do not be afraid, for I will show you kindness. Again, that word is said. For I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land of your grandfather Saul, and you yourself shall eat at my table always. He did obeisance again and says, what is your servant that you should look upon a dead dog such as I. I want to start with that. That's who Mephibosheth thinks he is. And friends, if we're going to get real for half a minute, I know for a fact, because I'm one of them, there are a couple people here who think that exact thing about themselves. I am a dead dog. I don't deserve any of this. Who am I that you should look upon a dead dog like me? Some of us think of ourselves this way in relationship or in connection to our relationship with God. We think of ourselves as dead dogs. We have this voice in us that tells us we're not worthy. We have this voice in us that tells us that we're the ones living in Lodabar. We're the ones who are sons of disgraced parents. We're the ones who are sons of sin and shame. And yet the King has invited us to his table. And not only does he invite us to the table, he gives us three things. He says, you're going to eat at my table. David offers Mephibosheth sustenance. He says, I'm going to give you land, which we're going to read in a minute. Lends a purpose to Mephibosheth's life that he did not have before, living in Lodabar. That land that's been restored to him gives him a purpose and a reason for living. And he restores all that Saul's house once owned. He restores his status. He restores his identity. He restores his status. And he restores his sustenance. This is the gift of King David. My mind cannot get over the distance between what Mephibosheth expected, what I expected, and what King David gave, what God gave. That, friends, is the gospel in the Old Testament. Do not be fooled by thinking that the gospel that begins with Jesus in Matthew is the beginning of God's grace. Is the beginning, is not the first book. The gospel has been unfolding in the story of God's people from the very beginning. And we see in David's action a beautiful model for us. What David has received from God, David is giving to the world around him. Now, if we take a step back for just half a second, David is not perfect. David is not Jesus. David goes on in another chapter or two, look at it next week, to make just the worst of mistakes. He goes on, not surprisingly, to be utterly and completely human. However, in this moment, what we see modeled for us, I think, is the height of discipleship. What we have received from God, we give to the world around us. And that's what David offers. I got to speed it up because I know I'm running out of time. Then King David summoned Saul's servant Ziba and said to him, all that belonged to Saul and to his house I have given to your master's son. I jumped the gun there, but this is part of restoring the status and identity. He's restoring Mephibosheth's place in society that had been stripped of him by not only the death of his father, but the disgrace of his grandfather Saul. That's all being given back to him. You and your sons and your servants shall till the land for him and shall bring in the produce, so that your master's grandson may have food to eat. Your master's grandson Mephibosheth shall always eat at my table. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. And then Ziba said to the king, according to all that my lord the king commands his servant, so your servant will do. Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. The image of eating at the king's table. Like this is the invitation that has been extended to us as followers of Jesus. Let me say that differently. This is the invitation that has been extended to the entire world. For those of us that respond to the invitation, we pull up a chair at the king's table. That's not a temporary thing. You're not a guest at the king's house that gets to eat, that gets to taste of the good stuff, but then goes back to Lodabar. Mephibosheth never returns to Lodabar. He eats at the king's table for the rest of his life. This is our story. This is who we are. Mephibosheth's story is our story. We have been invited to the king's table, not temporarily, not as a temporary guest, but eternally. We've been invited to the king's table. In verse 12 and 13, just to finish it out. Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah, and all who lived in Ziba's house became Mephibosheth's servants. Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he always ate at the king's table. Now he was lame at both feet. I love the reminder at the end of the chapter. At the end of the chapter. Don't forget, this guy, disgraced, lost, shamed, Mephibosheth. That's who ate at the king's table. Friends, I don't think it gets much better than that in the Bible. I suppose the Easter story is pretty big. But, at least in the Old Testament, I don't know, in 13 verses, if there is a better description of not just God's grace in the Old Testament, not just God's said in the Old Testament, not just of David's character. I don't know if there's a better description of discipleship. You talk about being a best man. That's being a best man. Understanding what God has given me and reflecting that to the world around me. This story, I think, is ripe for your reflection along multiple lines. Right? There are times in your life, and you'll see the questions there. Again, read all the questions, decide what you want to talk about. Not all of the questions are equally good. There are times in your life when you're Mephibosheth. There are times in your life when you're David. What are you doing in those moments? There are also times in your life, by the way, there's not a question about this because we're going to spend more time on it on Sunday. Also times in your life where you're asked to be Ziba. So I invite you to reread this story when you have time to go through it a little bit more slowly. And put yourself into it. Consider what it means for you to be the lost, disgraced, shamed son of Jonathan, grandson of Saul. Consider what it means for you to be David, sit at the seat of power, sit at the seat of abundant provision, and looking around for folks that don't have a seat at that table yet. There are times when we play both of those roles. What are you going to do? What does it mean for you to put yourself in this story? I don't mean theologically. You all know the church answer. You all know the Sunday school answer to these questions. That's not what I'm talking about. I mean, what are you going to actually do? How is this story, and more importantly, how is this principle going to actually change the decisions that you make on a daily basis? Because if it's not going to change your decision making on a daily basis, we need to have a different conversation. If it is going to change your decision making on a daily basis, then I suspect you'll see that your life will be changed. So, friends, before I let you go into groups, any questions for clarification? Anything that I spoke to that wasn't particularly clear that I can help you with before we break into our groups?
Just a quick reminder about the baptism. There's a couple separate factors. Nathan probably came to what trust how we got what do you need recognize someone who saw there.
So the question is, how did David get to this point? So I think there are two parallel tracks. One is David's relationship with Jonathan. David makes a covenant with Jonathan in 1 Samuel, what is it, Phil, 18? I think it's 1 Samuel 18. David makes a covenant with Jonathan. Hey, I'm going to care for your family. You're going to care for my family no matter what happens. So that's one track. The second track is 2 chapters earlier in 2 Samuel 7, where God makes a covenant with David. David asks God, hey, can I build you a house? Can I build you a temple? And God says, no, I didn't ask for a temple, but I'm going to build you a house in the sense of dynasty. And I'm going to set one of your sons on an eternal throne. And he says, I'll never remove my hesed from him. So that's how David gets to this place. Other questions of clarification? Anything online that we need to speak to? Okay.